Welcome back to Carly Stevens Books. My name is Carly Stevens, and I am super excited to have my guest today, Leslye Penelope, with me. She is an award-winning author, and her latest book, The Monsters We Defy, is just spectacular. So I am so glad that you agreed to be on this channel. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so one thing that drew me to you right away, even before I'd read any of your books, was just how you write in multiple genres, which goes against a lot of the accepted wisdom, I guess, both in traditional and indie circles. So, like, how do you balance writing in multiple genres? And I guess for people who don't know, what are some of the genres that you write in?
So I write, my first series was epic fantasy. So basically second world epic fantasy. And then I have paranormal romance, which mostly takes place, well, one of the series takes place in our world, present day. And then Monsters We Defy takes place in 1925. My newest paranormal romance series is the Bliss War series, which takes place in like a futuristic dystopian version of San Francisco. So I hop all over the place, mostly between fantasy and paranormal romance. But I kind of need to. It's like when I started out completely self-published. And so I was writing my first book, Song of Blood and Stone, which is the first epic fantasy, and it was really long. And so while I was waiting for that to get edited, I was like, oh, let me do something shorter, like a palette cleanser in our world without the heavy world building and having to create everything from scratch. So I wrote Angelborn, which is basically our world with angels and maybe some other beings too, and half angels. And so I went back and forth, book to book. And that was really good just to give myself a rest in between things. And so I liked that. I liked, doing one thing and then focus completely on that. And then for the next book, switching gears completely as just a way to rest my brain, rest my muse, and then before digging back into something a little harder and more intense.
Do you find that you can write more that way just because it doesn't take the same part of your brain, or uh, you know what I'm asking?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I do. I mean, I don't, by some standards, I'm fast. By indie standards, I'm not fast. But the first year I published, I did put out 4 books. Now, 2 of them had been written before then. And then things slowed down a lot, and then I got picked up by a traditional publisher. And so that's a longer process. And everything is kind of stretched out and you have to meet deadlines, but then you're waiting for your editor to get back to you for unknown amounts of time. It really could vary between 2 months and 8 months. And so then in between, I wanted to work on my own things, which is why I decided to stay hybrid and to do both publishing. But yeah, I think I can write a little bit more because I'm varying lengths of books and I'm also varying, the genres. Now, marketing wise, it can be tough. I think that whenever you're picking up one of my books, there's something in there that's going to be very similar, no matter if it's in the past or the future or whatever. But it definitely does go against the conventional, strategy of staying in one lane. And I just couldn't do that, just creatively. I just need to be in a bunch of different places. I always have a bunch of different balls in the air, and it's more satisfying to me, even if it may be not the best idea business wise.
I 100% understand that impulse. So you mentioned that there are still some things that people can expect from a Leslye Penelope or an L Penelope book. What are some of those elements that you think make your books uniquely yours?
I think that some of the themes are going to be very similar. Um, I'm usually writing about a heroine, like a young woman who is trying to find her place in the world or trying to find a sense of home or community. The Monsters We Defy is heavy on found family, and there's aspects of that in my other work as well. And also, I'm writing Black characters, and so whether they're in a fantasy world or our world, and it varies whether they're dealing with the things that Black people deal with in this world or just brand new, made up fantastical dramas and conflicts that are sort of based in real life conflicts as well. But those are some of the things. And I think there's always going to be a level of romance, whether it's a romance novel or a fantasy novel that has a romantic thread in it. I'm always interested in having that be a strong part of my books because I don't see the point of reading books without people falling in love.
I I love that. Yeah, I don't always read romance just straight up. But if there's no romance at all, I hear
You
what you're
miss it,
saying. There
right? Yeah,
needs, I do. I need a romantic subplot at least. I liked
exactly.
the Clara and Israeli thread in the
Yeah.
Monsters We Defy. So what I wanted to spend most of our time talking about is your the world building that you do. It's something that was one of the first things that I heard about regarding your work, just how immersive everything was, and you've already kind of touched on that. So, how do you go about building up some of those worlds? You said that your first series was epic fantasy. You were doing all of this original world building. Do you just sit down to do it all in advance, or does it sort of build on itself?
Yeah, I don't do it all in advance. I think that is a way that people kind of can get stuck. And I know plenty of writers who they've been spending years building a world, but there's no books, there's no stories finished. And that's one of the things that I wanted to address in the course that I created on world building. But for me, it's really about the story. Like the idea comes to me, whether the idea is usually it's some kind of image with a person in it and a character, or even just a topic. For the Monsters We Defy, the flash of inspiration was a 1920s fantasy heist, like a Harlem Renaissance era heist. So I didn't actually have any characters, but I had the time period. But for my epic fantasy series, for Song of Blood and Stone, I saw this young woman who was on the porch of her home with a shotgun in her hands as these people were coming. And that happens. It was originally the first chapter. I think now it's like the second or third chapter. But I had that and I didn't know anything else about it. So the world comes as I discover the character and the plot from that original story seed and that little kernel of the inspiration that comes. And it all kind of happens together. So it's like these concentric circles working their way out from this tiny point of inspiration. And then it's like, well, who is she? Okay, there's a world with a shotgun. So we're not in the medieval times, but we're not exactly in the modern day era either. So that series takes place in like an alternate 1920s. So there's cars and telephones, but it is definitely not high technology. And then there's magic also. And I, things like that will come from just other things that I've heard of, thoughts that I've had as I learn more about the characters. I'm always getting inspired by everything around me. So I will figure out, that aspect of the world. And then, okay, what is this magic? And then who are the two? I knew that there was a war. Well, who are they, the people fighting, and why are they fighting? And that brings me to the history. And then that connects back to my character. So all of those things, and that kind of is how all of the books happen, where I'm slowly expanding what I know about every aspect of the story, and the world is just another part of that. And so I get enough so that I can write an outline and a synopsis, because I am a plotter. So I do have to have some idea of where I'm going, even though it always changes. Like I will write up until about the midpoint and then change everything else that happens. And all the while, I'm still, especially with that first draft, learning, researching, figuring out details that I didn't know, and then usually having to research in order to figure out those details. Like I'll come up against a question that is the next chapter, or the next, a character comes that I haven't figured something out for. So there is a little bit of front loading and then a lot of figuring it out as I'm writing it, and then refining it with other drafts. And that's plot, character, and world. They kind of all work the same way.
Wow, that's such a great system, because even the part that you're front loading is organic to the character and the story. It's not just in isolation, wouldn't this be cool? It's how do all these things
Exactly.
interact, and these building questions. And I love that. It makes so much sense.
And you can work in the cool stuff too. It's like there's plenty of like cool factor where it's like I want to have this thing. I don't know how it works, but I can figure out a way to make it work with everything else. If I kind of brainstorm and have that groundwork already laid.
Do you go back and do that with the second drafts at all? Or is most of this set by
Definitely.
the time you finish the first?
No, a lot of it is still in the second draft. Yeah, my first draft, I do like fast drafting, which is something that I learned in order to finish NaNoWriMo before I ever published. So it's basically write the first draft as fast as you can, no editing, don't even read what you wrote before. So I try to write it in as short a period of time, like 4 to 6 weeks if possible, just getting through it, because I'm telling myself the story. and I don't want to have to change things. Like in chapter 3, I realized, oh, I have to change something in chapter 1. But then in chapter 10, I will change it again. So if I had gone back and changed it in chapter 3, then I'm just spending extra time that I don't need to spend. So by the end of the first fast draft, it's still a mess, but I have a better idea so that in the second draft, things can really come together. And usually my first and second drafts are pretty different. I mean, the story is the same, like the spine is the same, but I'm always discovering things and making notes of what to change, based on what I've already written and haven't gone back to read or revise. So yeah, the second draft is really where those things settle in and become, okay, this is actually what it really is. And I feel more confident about that.
Okay. I'm surprised that you're a fast drafter. You're what I've read of yours, which is Monsters We Defy, and then part of the first book of Song of
Oh,
Blood and
Blood and Stone.
Stone. Yes. It feels so layered that I just assumed that it would take you a while to, you'd write a little bit and then maybe you'd look up this question or something. So that's fascinating that you can still do both. Kind of
Yeah.
within, like, in addition to the research, you can also write part of it quickly, at least. That's very
Mm-hmm.
cool. So so what are some of the differences between world building for fantasy and, well, I guess they're both fantasy in separate ways, but and then more of a historical fantasy, like with the Monsters We Defy. There's so much that I didn't know about Washington in the 1920s, and that was one of the things I really enjoyed about the Monsters We Defy, is just those historical nuggets. So how does that research differ? Which, how is your process different?
Yeah. It's similar-ish. I mean, obviously, like setting it in the real Washington, D.C., I didn't have to build up the world from scratch and figure out 500 years of history like I did with Earthsinger Chronicles. But I still wanted to make this neighborhood and the city come alive. And I chose to try to be as historically accurate as possible, even though I was writing a fantasy story. So people have powers, and I've created this magic system, but the vast majority of everything else that is not magical is real. And so I did a lot of research on the time period and just trying to make those details come alive, because as I found out more things, as I discovered, I didn't know all these things about Black life in DC in the 1920s either. And I was like, oh, well, most people probably won't know them unless they're historians. So wouldn't it be cool to introduce people to all of these things, and real life historical figures come up in the novel? So that's definitely different than everything being created from scratch. But the process of like making a place come alive is very similar. So with second world fantasy, it's coming up with reasons why things are the way they are, and I spend a lot of time grounding it and trying to, with that process of discovering all of these things as I'm going and growing the world, the decisions that I make are kind of based on having these deep connections and having like thematic connections and connections with the character growth that are intertwined with the world. With a real place, I'm not doing that as much. I am, even though, I'm laying my invented neighborhood on top of the real neighborhood in the real city. And I'm still thinking about theme and how can I, what is around in the real place that I can use for the themes that I'm exploring and for the story and the character growth. So in that way, it's less work on one hand, but it's really not, because I spent just as much time. I was just focusing on different details and focusing on finding the real details and figuring out how to weave them into the fictional story and into the fantastical story.
What were some of your go-to resources for the historical information? I mean, my personal go-to for something like that initially would be Google, but you can't always trust those first
Right.
things to click on.
Well,
So
yeah.
how did you find the best stuff?
So I did all of my research during the beginning of the pandemic. So I couldn't actually go to libraries or anything. So I did obviously start with Google and Wikipedia, and then, always go into the bibliographies of whatever you are reading and try to find those sources. So I bought some used books from used bookstores to get the things I couldn't go to the library and get. And this was before the library was even doing, like, our library turned into, they put your book in a paper bag and you pick it up from the lobby. But this was before that. So a lot of like JSTOR, which is sort of a database of journals, a lot of academic journals and magazines and things like that. So I found academic information that way. Googling brought me to a lot of like PhD theses and dissertations on various topics that were perfect, that were fascinating. You know, people are doing PhDs in history in just one little narrow topic that I needed or decided I could use. And so sometimes you can't get those, but sometimes they're just online and you can just download them and read them, or sometimes you can buy them. And so, yeah, it was all online research through various things, whether it was articles, blog posts, newspapers. I did a lot of research on the Library of Congress website and other newspaper archives from newspapers of that time, and
Oh,
finding the Black newspaper from the 1920s in DC and just reading through it and searching through it. Once I had the main character, because the main character of that novel is based on a real person who had articles written about her because she became kind of notorious, then just searching the archives for any mentions of her or other things. Sometimes I would just look through the ads to get an idea of, okay, what were people buying? What were the hair products? What were the clothes? What was the fashion? Looking at just newspaper ads and flipping through pages. So that can be a great source of research as well.
that's that. How did you keep track of all of that? Did you have a document or something where you would just keep a lot of
I
those
created,
links or?
yeah. So what I'm doing now is I use Notion, the software Notion, which is sort of, people use it for a lot of things like project management. It's a really customizable sort of, I won't call it a database because that makes it sound complicated. It's pretty easy to use. But for this book, actually, I used Scrivener. So I had my Scrivener file. I was usually using Scrivener for a story Bible to keep track of all of the aspects of the, fantasy world anyway. And so Scrivener allows you to have like little separate documents inside of one document. And I would just use that to keep track of the research and the sources. So I had topics for everything, like nightlife in DC, history, jails, transportation. Like what was they were streetcars, and they didn't have a metro, but they were buses and streetcars. I had a document on that. Howard University, like just different topics had their own little file. And I would just dump in research and quotes and the source, the bibliography, into those documents and keep track of it that way.
That would be one of the harder aspects, but it sounds like you're very organized with all of the things that you bring in.
I try to be. It can be hard. Like figuring out the organizational system is something that, I recommend for writers to do up front, because that worked. And as long as it's digital, I could search for whatever, I couldn't remember where I put it, or I put it in a weird place, or I named it something and then I thought I had named it something else. So, it being in Scrivener, which is easily searchable, made it a lot better and easier to access all that stuff.
So when you're fast drafting, there's not a lot of time to be looking up all those little tiny, because there's always some little tiny thing that you just didn't even think to look up. Do you have a
Right.
method of kind of bookmarking that for yourself to go back
Mhm.
and add in
Yeah.
the research that you
So
need?
in the fast draft, there's no research. I don't even name all the characters. I'll just put name. I'll literally type up. I put in caps NAME for it, like, and that's the person's name until I figure out their name. So I either use all caps, which I can kind of see easily, or in Scrivener they have the annotation feature, which highlights it in red, and you can actually do a search for all the annotations. Or I'll just put a comment. So there's little Scrivener features that if you're writing in Word, you can do like comments, or some people have certain characters. Like sometimes I'll put like two asterisks on either side of something so I can go back and search for those two asterisks. And then, okay, this is where I was supposed to figure out, how they would get here, or what kind of transportation, or what this person's name is. Like, so it's a lot of placeholders in my fast draft, to the point of place names, character names. Sometimes it's just like, yeah, they're going to have a hard time doing this and they're going to figure it out. And then I keep it moving because I haven't figured out how they figure it out, but that's a second draft problem.
Hmm. I'm a bracket person myself, and then I just search for all the brackets, and those are, they figure out how to escape, name of person,
Right?
and yeah, that's
Exactly.
my go-to method for that. So you mentioned it earlier, but you have a world building course that you recently launched or you're about to. Um,
I recently launched it. Yes.
okay, well, awesome. So what are some of the things that that have that you've learned over time? I'm assuming that you've always been kind of a researcher personality and that kind of thing, but have there been any game changers, or can you give us a little teaser of something that you learned and you're excited to share with the world building class?
Sure, yeah. One thing that I remember learning that kind of changed the game for me was, and I don't even remember where it was, where I heard this from, but like communities and cultures have like an ethos. They have a thing about them that can make them unique that is like a core. And sometimes it can be like a stereotype. I use the example of Canada. Like in America, we think of Canadians as being really friendly, right? Or Germans. People think of Germans as being like rule followers and kind of strict. There's those things that on one hand you could call a stereotype, or you can call an ethos that it sort of is a way that people are in this place, and they're kind of is part of the culture, and there's probably historical reasons for it. Stereotypes don't always have to be a bad thing. They can be rooted in truth, and it's just that not everybody is going to fall into that line. So if I think about it as an ethos of a culture or a community, then it allows me to make that place feel unique. Like if friendliness and kindness is a value that they hold, then what does that say about them? Or what else can you glean from that? How do they greet each other? How does that impact maybe their funeral ceremonies or their marriage ceremonies? Or like if you're creating a brand new culture or society, if this place values respect above all else, or they value family or the elderly, your elders are venerated, what does that mean about every part of society, from the school system to the fashion? All of those things can be connected. And if that the value of that culture or society is part of the theme of your book, then everything kind of can come together really nicely. And I think the readers will feel that they might not see exactly what you're doing, but since it has sort of tendrils that spread everywhere, it's going to be infused in your whole story and make everything feel much more cohesive and complete.
I haven't thought about it in those words before, but I've always had a sense, or not, maybe not always, but for years I've had the sense that really good world building has that cohesion, has that sense of this affects this in ways that you don't necessarily understand at first, but there's
Like consciously, yeah.
yeah, everything fits together. It's because of this that we have to
Mhm.
address all of these other things, as opposed to just starting and making things up at random. But what a great way of thinking intentionally about what that glue is that's going to have those tendrils. I love that. That's fantastic. Um, so I guess I just have one more big question for you before we wrap things up, and that is, what are a couple of pieces of advice that you would give to new authors? So people who are not published, maybe they're working on finishing their first novel. What are some of those things that you would tell them, or that you wish you'd known yourself?
I think the best piece of advice I ever got when I was trying to finish like the first book or any book, I don't think I ever finished my very first book, but was do it first. And because it's so hard to prioritize other things. And a lot of writers are just trying to finish something and trying to find the time to spend on their writing when life is, getting in the way. And I found that do it first, or as close to first as possible, was really the best thing I did. I started, instead of staying up until 2 a.m. to write, I started getting up earlier to write and making sure that I did it. And I found out, oh, I write better in the morning than late at night. I don't think I'm a morning person, but my brain is a morning brain. So that's one of the things. And yeah, the other thing that I usually tell people is to really get clear on why they're doing this in the first place. Know your why. And it's something that you hear with in marketing terms, but writing is hard. Publishing is really hard. Whether you're going indie or traditional, there's ups and downs, there's heartbreak, there's jealousy, there's all these things. It's hard to get people to care and to know that your work exists so they can read it. And throughout all of these things that you're going to face in publishing, knowing and coming back to why you're doing it. Like, did you love writing as a little kid, or did you come to it later in life? Did you just have something to get off your chest that you wanted to say? I do believe that the world needs everyone's stories, and there's room for everyone. There's a niche of people that who are going to need your work and are going to really resonate with it. And, you know, if you start getting emails from readers, it's just the best thing ever. So coming back to it when times are hard and when you forget how to write, which happens with every book, and figure out like, why am I doing this? Why am I struggling through all of this drama? Oh, this is why. Okay, I'm going to get back up tomorrow and do it again.
So what's your why these days?
My why is that I started writing because I needed to sort of make sense of the world. I was incredibly shy as a child, like very, 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 very shy. And so the only way I had to, as a release valve of everything, all the emotions within me, was writing, because I couldn't really talk to people. And that's, even though I'm not extroverted, but I'm much more comfortable speaking to people and public speaking on all of that. I still have that at the core, as I have something inside that has to get out. And this is a healthy way to get it out it's not going to, you know, harm me. It's going to actually help my mental health and just allow me to share with the world. But mostly I do it for me because I really just need to.
Well, that's great. I think that resonates with a lot of people, me included. So, where can people find you if they want to buy your books or sign up for your world building course? How can they get in touch and find your work?
So my author website is lpenelope.com. And my website for writers, including I have a newsletter for writers that comes out every Monday, is myimaginaryfriends.net. So it's associated. I have a podcast and a newsletter, and that's where the course is too, at My Imaginary Friends.
Okay, perfect. And I'll put all those links down below as well, so you can follow those and check out all of Leslye Penelope's great stuff going on. So thank you once again so much. It was just a privilege to be able to have this chat. And that's all. Like this video if you like it, subscribe and all that stuff, and I'll see you next week.